Okay, Nalise, really nice to see you. Thank you very much for joining us today. Before we get started on the subject matter of our chat, could you just give us a little bit of an introduction about yourself and your area of expertise?
Yeah, sure. Thank you so much for inviting me today. It's lovely to be here. I'm looking forward to our conversation. So, yeah, as you mentioned, I'm Nalise. I work as a sustainability consultant. I've been working in this space for 8 years, going on nine, which is very exciting. I work across a range of environmental, social, and governance issues, but really my key area of expertise is climate and sustainability strategy and working with businesses to really understand how to accelerate their journey towards creating positive change.
So, if we jump into the first question I have here,
Yeah.
we're talking about sustainability and regulatory compliance. Obviously, two huge topics in their own right. But to what extent would you say that regulatory change actually drives businesses to accelerate their sustainability efforts? And how do other external pressures, such as market demands, stakeholder expectations, affect that relationship?
Yeah, very good question to start us off. I'd say based on my experience, regulatory change is definitely a key driver for businesses. I think we can't deny that. It's definitely what is causing businesses to advance their sustainability goals. But I'd say it's almost never the only factor, at least with the businesses that I've worked with. Regulatory changes are already there to provide a minimum standard that companies need to comply with. And these changes are coming about because of all those factors that you mentioned, whether it be stakeholder demand, whether it be new information that's coming to light. And all of this is really just encouraging businesses to take action. But I think many forward-thinking businesses, Ansell, others, they're all seeking to take action because they've recognized there are so many competitive advantages to doing that. So, for some businesses, that means responding to customer demand. For other businesses, it means recognizing efficiencies. And for other businesses, it's all about their brand, really strengthening that or even adapting that to meet either market demand or investor demand. So, yeah, I would say it's a real mix of compliance and opportunity that ends up driving progress.
When we talk about sustainability, for example, and the regulation that goes around that, people often just jump to carbon emissions as they that's how they focus on this, and that's what it's representative of the whole broader topic. But what broader ESG considerations can regulatory compliance encompass, and how can businesses really ensure compliance in that broader context?
Yeah, I think it's a really good point. So I think new regulations across lots of different topics can help a business in lots of different ways because, it really helps to set clear goals and benchmarks, which will end up guiding that action. But depending on the business, depending on the geography, even depending on the customers, there will be separate nuances or separate topics that will be more important for certain companies to focus on than others. So for certain businesses that I work with, particularly in retail or more manufacturing rather, I would say, water usage, waste management, even circular economy, these are big topics that they are monitoring, that they're being asked to report on. And then other companies working in other sectors, perhaps agricultural or real estate, they're focusing a lot on biodiversity or social factors like labor and human rights or community impact. So there really are a lot of different topics beyond just carbon that we look at. And I think what I've seen more and more recently is more and more regulation coming in, and that mix between social and environment spheres crossing is there's definitely impacts that we see from an environmental perspective that directly translate to a social perspective as well. So if we think about health and safety, we've always thought that health and safety is an important aspect, especially in recent years. If we think about chemical safety and products, that's coming more and more to light. But then how does that then translate into broader sustainability goals? How do we then look at not only the composition of the products that's going in there, but also the packaging? And all of a sudden, you're thinking about sort of wider green practices that businesses can adopt when looking at sustainability and wider efficiencies.
In your experience, how aware or how well educated are businesses to these broader topics? Do you find yourself going in and advising on the things they haven't yet considered, or are they pretty clued up before you talk to them?
It's a really good question. I definitely think it depends on the maturity in terms of sustainability of the organization and also the resources and expertise they have in-house. Some organizations, their legal teams are already looking at sustainability. They're already covering that off as part of compliance and risk review. And many businesses that have that assistance are quite clued up, at least on the compliance aspect of what they need to report on. Whereas other businesses who have professionals that come from a sustainability background or an environmental background are really aware of the fundamental issues and the fundamental connections and dependencies between some of these different environmental topics. And then you have businesses that don't have this compliance function necessarily related to sustainability or a sustainability professional.
Mm.
And that's usually where I come in to provide, as you mentioned, that education, a little bit of guidance on not only the compliance perspective, but also more holistically, what are we trying to achieve? What does this look like in the real world? What are some of those connections? And obviously, very specifically to their business, what does that mean for them?
As someone who, I'm based in the marketing world,
Yeah,
sustainability is all pervasive. It seems that every company in some form or other is talking about sustainability and their sustainability efforts. But
yeah,
that leads to the issue of greenwashing. So, how do stricter greenwashing regulations, such as those we're seeing in France right now,
yeah.
impact multinational businesses particularly, and their ability to sort of harmonize messaging across jurisdictions, across territories, across geographies?
Yeah, very good question. And I'm happy that you've chosen France as an example because I think, that really is a gold standard for us to look at the moment. What France has introduced is this very stringent regulation when it comes to greenwashing. And the reason they've done that is because they recognize the importance of transparency and accountability. Without those, we can't really individually or as companies back up any of the claims that we're making. So what they're requiring is really a lot of evidence-based information, which I think is great because it adds to the credibility of the company, but it also allows companies to feel very comfortable with disclosing their positioning transparently and understanding that this is not about punishing companies. This is about highlighting the fact that it's very difficult to find information on certain topics that these regulations require, and it really requires whole industries across the world and the whole supply chain and the value chain to have a bit of a wake-up call about what does it mean to have these claims? What does it mean to be able to calculate or gather the data that you need to back this up quite rigorously? Because without that, you aren't complying, and there is a lot of reputational damage and penalties that can come in, as a result of non-compliance. So companies should really be taking this seriously and should really be looking at countries or best practice that is being implemented at a company level when thinking about how to convey the importance of this internally and then how to act on this from an external perspective as well.
Does it actually create opportunities for those companies that are doing good or are applying best practice to actually find a point of differentiation?
Absolutely. I definitely think that companies which are transparently, reporting on their progress and who are doing the gap analysis, doing the audits that they need across the business, whether it be at a sector level, geography level, industry level, value chain level, they really are reaping the benefits because I think from a brand perspective, they're able to engage their customers, they're able to engage their value chain, to differentiate themselves, to show how they're acting on all of this, but also just from a compliance and risk perspective, they're really reducing the risk that comes with non-compliance. And I think that can take up a lot of time is, retrospectively having to go out in and update reports, retrospectively going in to find data. If you're just proactive about it from the beginning, you reap so many benefits in the end.
If we move on now to looking specifically at PPE, what are the
Yeah.
recent standards and regulations impacting that world, and how are they reshaping customer expectations and the overall supply chain?
of course, PPE, it plays a crucial role in so many industries, including the ones I've worked in, whether it's construction, whether it's manufacturing, whether it's healthcare. And I think it is really important that, industries or companies which do use PPE are aligning the use of that PPE with sustainability practices. So from the procurement to the treatment of the PPE, all of it needs to be considered holistically from a sustainability perspective. So if you just think about the life cycle of PPE, you want to make sure that that PPE is being sourced responsibly, it's being sourced from sustainable materials, it's recycled, it's produced with, minimal impact, but also you're thinking about that end of life management from the beginning. What is the purpose of this product and how long are we going to be using this? And based on that, how can we make the most informed choice? And when it comes to product passports, it's really important that businesses need to, give information transparently from their whole supply chain about a product's life cycle, as we just mentioned earlier, from the point of inception to the point of disposal. And I think this really feeds very well into eco-label schemes. Businesses more and more, due to regulation or due to customer demand, are needing to disclose information about a product's sustainability credentials, particularly if they're trying to claim that that product is green. And so in creating eco-label schemes, in creating product passports, it's going to make it much, much easier for consumers, whether that's B2B or B2C, to, of course, verify claims, but also, as we all want to do, make informed choices at the end of the day. So that's really where I would see a lot of the change happening and where I see the importance of PPE fitting into sustainability practices.
Beyond simply complying with regulation and therefore avoiding any punishment, what are the broader benefits to a business of meeting their regulatory responsibilities? And you mentioned brand, for example, earlier.
It's something that I often end up speaking about a lot to individuals and professionals focused on finance and budgets. Sustainability manager will come to me and say, how do I sell this internally? Or, how do I convey the importance of this? And for me, it really is about the tangible and the less tangible aspects, the financial and non-financial sort of metrics that we can associate with this. So, as we already mentioned, it's absolutely going to enhance your brand reputation, because what it's really doing is it's signaling to your stakeholders, whether that be a customer, an investor, even a regulator, that your business is really committed to responsible practices. And that's going to have knock-on effects inevitably to, customer loyalty. That's probably going to increase. That's what most customers are seeing, because consumers more and more want to support brands that align with their values. And I think younger generations, but also older generations who are thinking about, their children and perhaps other people in their lives, want to make sure that we are leaving the earth in a better place than the way that we found it. From an environmental perspective, but also from a social, perspective. We want to make sure that we're advancing a lot of social goals. We want to make sure that people are being paid a living wage. We want to make sure that people are being treated ethically. And I think that's a general consensus that most people can agree on. And so as consumer demand is moving more in that way, consumers are going to be much more wary about who they partner with, where they spend their money, and ultimately, I guess, where they pledge their loyalty in that way. So at least in my experiences, what I've seen is that, there are a couple of businesses who are either consistently meeting or sometimes even exceeding a lot of these standards. And what that's doing is that's building trust. And I think that's very, very valuable for, service providers, but also goods providers. And I think ultimately what all businesses are striving for is really a long-term partnership. When it comes to regulatory change, when it comes to market changes, you want to make sure that you feel confident that your business is still going to survive those changes, that you feel resilient. And so I think in creating competitive advantage, in making sure you secure that customer loyalty, enhancing your brand, all of that from an external and an internal perspective is going to attract the best customer base, attract the best talent, all of who are looking for businesses that have very strong ethical values, and that will come through in the sustainability initiatives and the sustainability goals that you're prioritizing.
We've talked about how wide-reaching the implications of sustainability and regulatory change and the evolution of regulation is as well. And
Yeah,
so I suppose there are lots of companies that put their heart and soul in, if you like, into achieving compliance.
yeah.
However, is there a challenge about maintaining and managing it once that's been achieved?
Yeah, I think every business that I've ever worked with struggles with this. Doesn't matter the size, doesn't matter
Yeah.
the sector. Um, I think what all businesses kind of know is, not just sustainability, but when it comes to any sort of area of the business, you want to continuously improve, and sustainability is no different. And yeah, I would say it's all about trying to walk before you can run. So, before you're trying to tick off every single box, just try and achieve compliance. Just try and identify what it is in the first instance that you actually need to do, whether that's working with an expert or whether that's in-house that you're getting that information. Just try and make sure you understand what it is that you need to monitor. And then I think a lot of businesses then realize, well, I need to monitor if I'm going to stay ahead of regulations, but I also need to be able to have this flexibility where if I am monitoring, I can then in real time also adapt to some of these changes. So it is really important, I would say, to set up a system digitally, ideally, where you can track that compliance, but you can also track, all of the other great things that you're doing, and capture those key sustainability metrics. And given that most businesses are now being audited, I think it just makes auditing so much easier. Again, you're setting yourself up for success, to make that monitoring burden a little bit lighter.
And do you think the companies, in your experience, the companies that you work with, are they prepared for that? Or is it something, again, that they need to be reminded of?
Yeah, I think it's a big mix. I think especially larger corporates, they already have a lot of systems in place, that do help. Sometimes those are legacy systems and they don't quite meet what you need for sustainability. And I see a lot of companies trying to use systems they already have in place, which aren't really optimal, to then try and report on sustainability metrics or try and capture data related to sustainability. And it doesn't really work very well. So I do think it is important to have the right tool for the job.
Mm.
And a lot of companies are recognizing that more and more. I think we've seen within the sustainability and ESG sort of measurement and reporting space, especially software as a service. There are so many players in the market now. It's really exploded in the last couple of years. And I've seen that, and I've worked with many of these providers, and it really does streamline reporting and managing of compliance and monitoring of compliance so much. And so I think the companies that are larger and have already realized that they need these systems have them in place, or at least are looking towards those systems and are realizing the benefits. But then smaller companies or companies where sustainability isn't really top of the agenda, or even companies that have undergone mergers and acquisitions where there's a lot of different parts at play, sometimes need to be reminded of or reintroduced to or introduced to for the first time to a lot of systems or digital tools, whether that is a sustainability management software or whether that is a software as a solution focused on a specific topic like carbon emissions. And then, it's not a difficult conversation to have, because I think as soon as they see a lot of the better tools, they start to understand, the return on investment and the benefits that it's going to bring.
One of the most significant, I guess, changes or introductions to legislation around sustainability recently has been the EU deforestation regulation. So, why now is deforestation such a critical issue? Why is it so high on the agenda? And what
Yeah.
unique responsibilities would you say that companies in the PPE industry have towards meeting that regulation, but also its impact?
Yeah, such a good question. I really love when people ask me this question, because this is something that I'm really passionate about, and something that I studied all those years ago in university, and it's always been difficult for me to understand why it isn't higher on the global agenda, because I think it's such an easy concept to grasp. But honestly, I think, at least from my perspective, I think it's so high now on the global agenda because people are finally recognizing, and being provided with, I guess, the evidence as well of the critical role that deforestation is playing in climate change. I mean, it's undeniable, and of course, biodiversity loss. To try and just break it down as simply as I can, I guess you can think about forests as a carbon sink, something which is capturing carbon. And so when we're destroying, you know, forests or large areas of land which are capturing a lot of this carbon, what it's doing is it's releasing a lot of those greenhouse gas emissions that were captured previously. And of course, that's contributing quite significantly to global warming. So if we think about the PPE industry specifically, I guess, PPE relies a lot on raw materials such as rubber, which of course come from forests and from land. And because of that, the EU DR, in short, is really just there to try and explain what the direct implications are of deforestation and what the direct implications are for land use change. And businesses which are using PPE, but also any business really who's relying on raw materials, really needs to think about, when it comes to your material, is it in any way linked to deforestation? Is it in any way linked to land use change? From an environmental perspective, of course, kind of just explained that in a moment ago, but we also need to start thinking about this from a social perspective. There are indigenous people and local communities who live in these areas, who rely on these pieces of land and rely on these ecosystems. And they're the ones typically who are most affected by land use change. And I think that's not spoken about enough. So really, when I think about deforestation, I think about unfairness. And when we
Mhm.
think about reversing that and we think about the EUDR, this is really about making sure that there's an introduction and a maintenance of fair practices. From a company's perspective, they should be making sure that they're doing very, very thorough due diligence across their whole value chain, not just in tier one, not just direct, but throughout the whole value chain. And I think what's very important here is to have that direct relationship and dialogue with suppliers because they might not have access to the information. They might not fully grasp or understand the extent of the problem or what they can do. So really having that direct relationship with suppliers and engaging with them directly plays a big part. But then you can also, of course, use certifications that have been around for a very long time. For example, FSC or Forest Stewardship Council. And what these are really doing is they're helping you to verify that the products you're purchasing are coming from a sustainable source.
Mhm.
So it's really about just making sure that you have that reassurance about where things are coming from. And again, as I mentioned, sort of the fair practices around that. And I would say one of the best examples I've seen from a client, and I really, really encourage other companies to do the same, is, make sure that you're thinking about the community as a stakeholder. They can offer amazing opportunities for partnerships. And if you can find ways of really making sure that they are fairly compensated, not only will you boost productivity or your own brand, but you'll also be supporting some of these local economies. And
Mhm.
often there's very vulnerable populations, as I mentioned, who are affected by this. So you're also offering that extended protection to them and their livelihoods from a truly sustainable perspective. So to me, that's why I think it is so high on the agenda and why it should be so high on the agenda, not just from a social perspective, but also, of course, from an environmental perspective.
Clearly something that is very close to your heart. And I hope listening
Yeah,
to you talk, I hope some of that passion is received by the companies that you speak to, because it
yeah,
to me, when you describe it in that way, it becomes that's it's a genuine example of sustainability, which sustainability
yes,
can never be a single act or a single impact. It's necessarily a chain of events, isn't it? So yeah,
it really
it's
is.
really nice to hear you speak like that about something that's so important. Final question for now, Nalise, and it's about the future, really.
Yeah.
As someone who is expert in this area, what emerging trends do you see shaping the future landscape of sustainability and compliance around that? And how can businesses prepare to stay ahead of the game as those new changes, those evolutions happen?
Yes, such a good question. I think I get asked that as well often. in different ways. It gets phrased differently depending on who I'm speaking to, and everyone has their own agenda. But I guess there's a couple of things that inherently are going to happen. And then there's a few things that I think could happen, and I'll differentiate them that way. So I think what is inevitable is that, regulations are going to become stricter and stricter globally. So at the moment, we're seeing particular countries or continents such as Europe really leading the way, with regulations such as CSRD. You spoke about France earlier, anti-greenwashing and what they're doing. These are good examples of how regulation is focused in a particular continent, a particular area, and how it's becoming stricter and stricter. But that is really trickling out to all corners of the world. We're seeing in America, the SEC is a great example of where, again, more stringent climate disclosures are required, more stringent reporting on sustainability practices are required. But I'm also seeing the same, across Asia and across the Pacific. I was recently in Bermuda, and I was really impressed by the fact that even there, banks and other reinsurance companies, for example, that I'm working with there, they're already looking ahead and seeing what other continents are doing and seeing what potential clients are doing, and trying to already adapt and look at focusing on that. And the Bermudian government, as a result, is already now looking at how they can prepare themselves from a regulatory perspective. So it's very interesting to see regulation and, I guess, response to that regulation trickle to all corners of the world. And what's been very interesting, and what I think will continue to happen more and more, is that this regulation is going to go beyond carbon. It's going to go beyond just these siloed, sort of very specific topics. And it's going to start focusing on bigger principles, bigger ideas, bigger topics, which are the real topics we're talking about that drives, for example, climate change. And that's things like biodiversity, that is, circular economy. But of course, definitely social issues are coming in more and more, and we're seeing that. And then I think maybe a bit more controversially, a lot of people that I'm speaking to, a lot of the companies that I'm speaking to are talking about living in the, age of technology.
Mm.
And now more than ever before, we have access to so much information, but also misinformation. And we need to find ways of being able to deliver that information in a more streamlined way, in a more secure way. And so more and more, I think we're starting to see a lot of digital transparency tools, for example, blockchain, coming into play. And I think that these could become quite a key requirement for companies to prove their sustainability claims. It's already something that the CSRD is looking at in terms of digital tagging more broadly, but something to digitize and standardize a lot of the ways that this information is presented and then accessed. So I think any business that is going to be proactive and embracing this is going to see a lot of long-term benefits. And those that don't are going to fall behind. So I guess my leaving and parting thoughts and advice would really be, start with a very thorough gap and needs analysis. Sit down around the table, just be very transparent. Talk about where the company stands today in terms of sustainability, and it doesn't matter where that is. We just want to create a baseline and start to think about how this links to your business strategy. Who are your customers? Who are your investors? Who are your key stakeholders? What do they want? What do you as a business want? What do your employees want? What are some of those stakeholder needs and business needs as well? And then start to think about where there's an overlap and maybe where there needs to be change. And in doing that, I think what you're going to end up with is being in a position where you can set really clear goals, which are going to align not only to sustainability goals, but to broader business goals, which are really, really, really important. And in doing that and identifying all of those stakeholders and involving them early on, you can really create a roadmap for success. And that's something that I help a lot of businesses with, is just how do we actually deliver on these goals? How do we actually reach targets? How do we actually respond to the change that we say we want to create? So that's really important. And then, as I mentioned, kind of going back, make sure you have the right tools then for the job to be able to monitor your progress, to review your progress in real time, And whether that's partnering with a particular tool that focuses on carbon, whether that's focused on a tool that looks on wider ESG or sustainability issues, just make sure it's the right tool for the job and that you can really integrate it easily into your business. And I think if you do all of those things, it still circles back to the beginning, what we spoke about. Not only are you going to be compliant, but more importantly, you're going to be competitive. And I think businesses have to look at compliance and competitiveness in the same lens and see them both as equal when it comes to sustainability.
Nalise, thank you. That's a wonderful way to finish things off, and I think it really does summarize what we've learned here today perfectly. It's been fascinating to get such an expert insight into not only the nature and shape of regulation, but all of the potential benefits and advantages, as you mentioned, of really considering sustainability and regulation in their widest possible context. So thank you very much. Thoroughly enjoyed that.